Hello race fans, Keith Collentine here. Let's go through the field for the 2019 Azerbaijan Grand Prix, starting with the 4 drivers who didn't see the checkered flag. A misjudged attempt at overtaking by Daniel Ricciardo brought an early end to his race. He went down the escape road at turn 3 trying to pass Daniel Kvyat, and then making matters worse, he reversed into the Toro Rosso driver and his former teammate as he tried to get out. The damage forced both drivers to retire. Kvyat had started the weekend well, making it into Q3, but dropped back very quickly in the first stint. He was the first of many drivers to really struggle with those soft tyres at the beginning of the race. Romain Grosjean had another miserable weekend for Haas. He didn't make it out of Q1. Haas's qualifying pace hasn't been that bad previously, and as usual in the race it wasn't that hot either. As for Pierre Gasly, it was a strange weekend for him. It started off on the wrong foot when he got a penalty for missing the weighbridge during second practice, which meant he had to start the race from the pit lane. He showed some pace in qualifying. He was fastest of all in Q1, but then it emerged that he'd exceeded the maximum fuel flow limit, and so perhaps that wasn't quite as good a barometer of how quick he was after all. In the race, he moved up to 6th place by running a really long first stint, but then he dropped out with a suspected problem at the rear end of the car. Bit of a mixed bag for a driver who's had a tough season so far. Getting in amongst those who saw the checkered flag, and once again it was the 2 Williams drivers at the back. Robert Kubica did not distinguish himself by planting his car into the barriers during Q1. His race then got off to a poor start when the team inexplicably sent him to the pit lane exit to start the race 10 minutes too soon, which meant he got a drive-through penalty. George Russell's weekend started very poorly indeed. He wasn't very well when he arrived in Baku, and within a few laps of practice starting, he got a shock when he hit a loose drain cover, which tore the bottom of his car off. He wasn't able to take any further part in Friday's practice while the team readied his spare car. Once he got up and running again, though, he had a decent weekend and was never really troubled by Kubica in the race, although, of course, that drive-through penalty did have a significant bearing. It was a tough all weekend for Nico Hülkenberg in the Renault. The car just never seemed to have any pace. He didn't make it out of Q1, and he was a long way behind in the race as well. Much the same could be said for Kevin Magnussen. Haas continuing to have these problems where as soon as the tyres start graining in the race, they just can't get them to switch back on again. Magnussen found his car was not that bad when he switched to new tyres. He was one of a handful of drivers to take an extra set of tyres towards the end of the race, but once again the pace just dropped off and he wasn't really in contention for points. Antonio Giovinazzi's weekend began on the back foot because he had to take a 10-place grid penalty as Alfa Romeo finally got around to replacing the control electronics, which the team needed to change really for the previous race in China. That meant Giovinazzi started down towards the back. He didn't make his way into the top 10. He was passed by teammate Kimi Räikkönen on the way. Both the Toro Rossos looked pretty quick in practice, but Alexander Albon wasn't able to accompany his teammate Daniel Kvyat into Q3. In the race, he finished where he started. He clouted the barrier on the first lap, but was able to keep going, and he passed Magnussen and Giovinazzi in the final stages, but ended the race around about 2 seconds behind Kimi Räikkönen. The Alfa Romeo driver finished in 10th position. He'd been very unhappy after qualifying when he got a bit too close to Lewis Hamilton during Q3, which really spoiled his lap in that session. Antonio Giovinazzi was actually quicker than him. Matters got worse on Sunday morning when it emerged that his car had failed a post-qualifying technical inspection for its front wing deflection, and he had to start the race from the pits. From there on, however, he played a bit of a blinder. He did just 6 laps on the soft tyres at the start, then switched to the mediums, which he kept running all the way to the end of the race, a massive 44-lap stint, and it was ultimately that which brought him home in the top 10 for the final point. Lance Stroll still hasn't managed to get his racing point as far as Q2 in qualifying, but he did a decent job in the race this weekend, taking it home in 9th position. Though you have to have a look at what Sergio Perez was able to do with the car and conclude that it was capable of quite a bit more. Stroll finished behind the 2 McLaren drivers. Lando Norris qualified ahead of the 2 but ended up finishing the race behind his teammates Carlos Sainz Jr. after McLaren pulled a bit of a strange strategic move towards the end of the race. Norris was running behind Perez. The team decided to bring him in for a set of soft tyres during the virtual safety car period that was caused by Pierre Gasly. That really didn't work out for Norris at all. The pit stop was a little bit sluggish, but most importantly, he just simply couldn't get any speed out of those soft tyres, as we saw was the case for so many other drivers in the race, and he wasn't able to catch up to Sainz. And so it was Sainz who brought the lead McLaren home in 7th position. That's the first time he's scooped points for the team. Sergio Perez once again proved to be an absolute master of Baku. He was the best of the rest in qualifying, which translated to 5th position on the grid, and he even got ahead of Max Verstappen for a few laps at the start of the race, although he quickly realised that he wasn't going to be able to keep the Red Bull driver behind, and sensibly concentrated on staying ahead of the McLaren pair. That worked out brilliantly for him. He brought the car home in 6th position, and realistically, there wasn't anything better on the table for Racing Point in Baku. But what about Charles Leclerc? In so many ways, the sympathetic hero of the opening 3 races, he came a bit of a cropper in Baku, you have to say. He was quickest throughout practice and was looking in fantastic shape in qualifying until he smacked the barrier at turn 8. That was while he was trying to get a lap done on the medium compound tyres. The mediums eventually turned out to be by far the best tyre for the race, and if Ferrari had been able to get their cars through on that tyre, they would have been in a much stronger situation for the Grand Prix. As it was, Leclerc got into the lead of the race by lap 13, but once he pitted to put those soft tyres on, that really was the undoing of his race. Ferrari really didn't help matters by leaving him out quite as long as they did on the medium tyres, but when you look at the pace he had, or rather didn't have on the soft tyres at the end, you can see there wasn't really an opportunity for him to finish much higher than he did once he'd had that crash. Max Verstappen was the driver who benefited most for Red Bull, claiming his 3rd consecutive 4th place finish. The car doesn't look quite there to take the fight to Mercedes and Ferrari just yet, but it may well prove to be on tracks that suit it a little bit better than the long straights of Baku did. Sebastian Vettel very nearly had the same crash as Charles Leclerc in qualifying. He had a big sideways moment at turn 8 as well in Q2, but managed to keep it out of the barriers. He did his qualifying lap without the benefit of a tow and ended up in 3rd place, about 0.3 of a second off the Mercedes drivers. Had he had the benefit of a slipstream, he surely would have been in contention for a front row starting position. As it was, in the opening stint of the race, he had pretty poor pace, you have to say, on the soft tyres. At that point, he really lost touch with the Mercedes drivers, and that was it as far as challenging for the race win was concerned. If anything, he was perhaps a little bit lucky that the virtual safety car appeared when it did, because that really blunted Max Verstappen's attempt to get on terms with him. And so for the 4th time in as many races, we find ourselves talking about a 1-2 for the Mercedes drivers. Lewis Hamilton had the potential to put his car on pole position. He lost quite a bit of time in the first sector on his qualifying lap. He might have taken the lead at the start if he'd been a bit more robust with Valtteri Bottas, and he said he probably would have done if he'd been up against a driver from a different team. And then in the final stages of the race, when we had that virtual safety car period, Hamilton was slightly slower in getting up to speed compared to Bottas, and that really made the difference in the final reckoning. He had one last chance to get on terms with his teammate. A little mistake at the exit of turn 16 on the penultimate lap put paid to that. So Valtteri Bottas took the race win, and with it the championship lead by a single point, thanks to the bonus point he scored back in the Australian Grand Prix for the fastest lap. It was great stuff from the Mercedes driver, and you have to say, if nobody else is going to take the fight to Mercedes, at least the 2 Mercedes drivers are taking the fight to each other. Thanks for watching. For more Formula 1 stats, facts and analysis, make sure you follow @racefans.net on Twitter and on Facebook. Plus, hit the subscribe button at the top right now so you don't miss our next video on YouTube.